Okay. Don't. Now, hopefully this is still working over here. It looks like it is. And lecture notes. So we were let's start talking about Benjamin West, neoclassicism in Britain and the colonies, especially since, oh man, especially since we're talking about so much for the clip, huh? Just leave it right there and everything will be fine if I don't get up, right? And remember that when we're talking about Britain, we have to talk about Britain writ large because of the fact that it's they're still colonized at this point. And we were looking at Benjamin West, and the image on your right, which is another of these classical images that's meant as an allegory for contemporary events, in particular, the coming war between America and Britain, right? And I'm not quite sure where this fell relative to July the 4th, right? But the shadow cast over Cupid's face as he presents Helen to Paris is linking then the beginning of the Trojan War, represented by Helen, with the outbreak, the beginning of the War of Revolution between us and Britain. Right? Now, on your left, Benjamin West's most famous picture, up in Ottawa, Canada, is a contemporary history picture rather than an ancient history picture. It's probably his best known painting and a quite contemporary scene. Not exactly contemporary. The event depicted here comes from 1759, which is when the Battle of Quebec was fought during the run up to the French and Indian War, right? And this was, in fact, the Battle of Quebec was one of the decisive battles in the French and Indian War. Benjamin West said that this was the conquest of a great province in America by the British troops. Remember that he's a Tory, that's what we used to call them, British sympathizers. Today the Tories are just the Conservative Party in England, right? But back then a Tory was someone living in the colonies who supported British rule, ongoing British rule, rather than American independence. And West was a Tory, and he's gone back to London by this time, right? So he thinks this is a great conquest. This is a great, a great change in things. I'm sorry, this is a bit pixelated in the back. There's a runner in the back coming forward, holding a standard and waving a tricorn hat. The flag that he has actually has the fleur-de-lis on it, the French fleur-de-lis. And this is to show that Wolfe did not die in vain, that the French would be defeated at this great battle, even though they've lost one of their military leaders. Right? Also worth noting in the foreground that there's an Iroquois Indian right down to the tattoos, which are pretty cool, actually. I just got a better scan of this, so I'd never really seen his leg tattoos before, or his shoulder. Those lines, and even on his head, right, squiggle running up the side of his head. Part of this is to show that this death, not only was it not in vain, but also it was mourned universally, right? That not only British soldiers were mourning the death of General Wolfe, but the Iroquois, right, who they had marshaled to their aid, were also saddened at his passing. So what we see with this picture is that he's no longer using ancient history to illustrate modern problems, right? This is modern history meant to illustrate modern problems. And when he painted this in 1770, remember that West had left America and gone back to London, right? And he displays this in London as part of the Royal Academy, which we talked about last week. And the head of the Royal Academy, Sir Joshua Reynolds, who we saw last week, criticized him. And he said that it was not appropriate to paint a military scene without putting them in classical costumes. He said you should have put them in togas and stuff, right? So, which is really kind of antithetical to the way we think of things, right? We would want it to be something that's really quite historically accurate. And that's in fact what West says, is that this is the way it really was, even though he wasn't there, right? This is the way it really happened, and that's the important thing to show. So he's bucking the trend. The tradition had been to allude to battles, allude to military victories, or defeats, or martyrdoms, using classical allegory. And we saw that West had done that as well, right? But here he's showing us this. And West said this region of the world was unknown to the Greeks and the Romans. So there's no point in trying to make a sort of exemplum virtutis out of classical antiquity for this, right? And this goes hand in hand with something we know about Benjamin West. When he got back to London and tried to enter the art market in London, right? He's going to make a name for himself as a painter in London. He uses his background of having been born in the States, in the colonies, as a way to set himself apart from the other artists. And he creates this whole personal myth about his reputation as an American painter in London, right? Coming straight from the colonies with all these things he's learned in the colonies that you can't get from any other artist working in London. You can only get it from Benjamin West. And part of this was to argue that all of his works were absolutely accurate. And in his studio, where he was selling paintings of American subjects, right, he kept artifacts that he had collected in the colonies. So you say, look, you see, there's the moccasins, right? Here's the peace pipe, right? Here's the costume that Wolfe wore. He was given sort of a gallery of trinkets to prove the point, right? When really the gallery of trinkets worked in a different way, right? This little collection of stuff was really probably the stuff he used to put the picture together because he wasn't there, right? He's got to create this out of something. So he has these props that he's using. And that's something, everybody back to Rembrandt had done. He even went so far, this is the funny part, he kind of went so far as to claim that he had received pigments from the Native Americans. The Indians had given him their pigments and was using them in his works. And this is totally made up. There's just it's not how it happened. But still, that's what he was telling people, and they sort of bought it hook, line, and sinker, that this was the way. They're getting these authentically American pictures painted in an authentically American way, which you couldn't get from Sir Joshua Reynolds or any other artist working there, right? And it's this personal myth to sell pictures. Artists love personal myths, and I mean artists writ large, Who is it? Who's the great blues guitarist from the 20s? Robert Johnson claimed that he got his guitar got his talent by selling his soul to the devil, right? And that's how he became such a great blues guitarist. And, it's a personal mythology that creates this persona that helps to push your career forward. But again, even though whatever he may argue, it's not accurate because he wasn't there. He's making it up, right? And in fact, of all the people that you see here, only one of those people was actually there, other than Wolfe, who obviously was. But of the people we can identify, only one of them, the guy, the gray-haired guy just over his head, right, directly over him. He's the only one that was really there. The rest of them were not. And they paid him to be included. And in fact, when the daughter of one of the people who was there said, "Why isn't he there?" Or somebody asked her, "Why isn't your father there?" She said, "Well, he refused to pay West to be put inside." So the people that are there are this group portrait, are there even though they weren't there to see it. They're there to sort of allegorically mourn this, right? So it's totally fabricated. And so let's see. A bit ahead of myself by saying that, but that's okay. Because it's fabricated, because it's a constructed piece attempting to make you think that, to sway your opinion, to make you think that Wolfe died a martyr's death on the battlefield, right? he bases the overall composition on a rather traditional kind of picture. What does it look like to you? What does it resemble in the way of traditional, earlier pictures, this being a neoclassical work? Does it remind you of anything? Kiki, you're about to read. Yeah? All right. Sorry? The death of Socrates. I could see that. In fact, that would make a really nice compare and contrast, wouldn't it? Because one is an exemplum virtutis, right, for broader things, where this is documenting a single. What's interesting, that's a little bit later, right? That's 1780s. So that's after this one. But I'm thinking more along the lines of a traditional picture going back to the Renaissance that he might have used. Kiki. Death of Christ, exactly. Where instead of a cross behind him, we have the flag upright, and he's being held by his followers, surrounded by mourners, who give us a wide range of reactions to the death of General Wolfe, from some that are stoic, like our fellow on the right, to others that are rushing in to get a last glimpse, like the group on the left. Even the fire of battle, right, has darkened the sky on one side. And that's typical for images of the death of Christ, that we see the sky go dark. It's part of a biblical prophecy that the sky went dark at the moment of Christ's death. And so we often do see images where half of the sky is bright, half is dark. And so it's really quite an obvious allusion to the death of Christ. We didn't really talk about this, but with the death of Marat, Jacques-Louis David did the same thing with the slung arm of Christ coming out of the tub, or the slung arm of Marat coming out of the tub, being sort of making like a Christ-like martyr. I brought in an image. This is famous enough that he might have used it as he's putting it together, because you can see, in fact, how some of the gestures are the same. In this one, John the Evangelist in the pink has his arms thrown back, quite like the figure in the green on your left. The Virgin Mary coddles Christ with other figures stooping around him, and you can see how some of the central composition here seems to suggest the knowledge of Giotto, often looked at as the first great artist of the Renaissance, early Renaissance, right? But people have pointed to a number of different artists that he may have been looking at, because as we've seen with neoclassicism, when they make references to earlier art, it's never slavish, right? They're not slavishly copying things. What they do is they take it and they manipulate it, they tease it, so that the composition looks original but has those references to give it support. And I think for those of you studio artists, right, the idea of using art not just to make copies of it, but to support the things you're trying to say with your works, things you're trying to represent, is something. I'm no great fan of neoclassicism. That's something you could learn from that, right? There's a good way to use artistic precedents. Yeah. Some people have pointed to this Van Dyck picture as being one that he used, because it's almost like West has got the Virgin Mary's face, doesn't she? But at the same time, the body of Christ and the body of West are in such similar poses. So again, it's that idea of the imaginative manipulation of your prototypes, right? The fact that Wolfe's body is the reverse of Christ suggests that West wasn't looking at the painting so much as he was looking at a print after the painting, because when an engraved copy is made, because of the printing process, it will be reversed, right? Because you engrave it on a plate following the original, and then you print it on a paper and you get the mirror, right? So it's a good chance that he knows this. And then our old friend Raphael, who we talked about before, also, there's something about that central grouping of figures that, and especially the older gent behind, that really reminds us, right? Look at the face, the two heads. Oops, sorry about that. Let's go back if I can. Donk, right? Now I'm trying to go over here. There. Right? If you look at this head here, see him, and compare him to the head of Joseph, this guy right there, right? That head. and compare them to Joseph's head here, you can see that it in fact is a really, really close comparison between the two, right? So, what's going on here now? There, right? So he's using lots of references. Now, there's the guy that was actually there. Lieutenant Henry Brown is his name, and he's the only one in the picture who was really there that I mentioned before. And you can see the sort of accuracy that West is trying to bring to the musket, for example. It's something we'll talk about again, this idea of realism, this idea of that kind of honest accuracy, how the style of a picture can be seen as part of its meaning. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about it now. One of the things we're going to see with American art, especially this earlier colonial period of artists that spent time in America, and I think it's something that really defines a lot of American art, is this interest in realism as a moral value. We can think, if you think about style, like why do you choose particular styles? What do they do? Is there anything that the style itself can communicate independent from what it represents? When we think about artistic stuff. And I'm a firm proponent of the idea that art, the style of art, can indeed convey meaning independent from the subject matter. And we can talk more about that, but I mean, you know, if you think about naive styles of art, for example, they can give us something about art that is closer to an unlearned and thus more emotional kind of root, you know. And here with the kind of realism that we see with West, with this sort of intricate, right down to the metal work on the gun, we can talk about realism as being kind of an honest style. Truth to nature. Unfiltered by, right, his own input. And at the same time showing off, right, the ability to reproduce precisely. So a couple meanings that come out of the style here. And this idea that it is truthful and thus it's honest is something that a lot of people have argued is kind of a hallmark of American art up until the middle part of the 20th century, that it's part of the reason why certain movements lingered longer in America, why it took us so long to figure out modernism, was because we were holding on to that tenet of truthfulness, right? Honesty, these American values, or things that we say are American values, right? And it's stump time, right? So everybody's saying truthfulness, honesty, right? Everybody's figuring out what's going wrong with Hillary's campaign, talking about, you know, a lack of transparency, you know, and then people think she's not being truthful and all of this. It just is something about, there's something particularly American about this value of honesty that I think shows up in the art as well. And something we'll see again with other artists today or soon, right? So Brown was there, but the rest of them weren't. And like I said, when the daughter of one of them is John Hale, when she was asked why he wasn't in it, said he would not give the printer the sum of $100 or 100 pounds is what he wanted, right, to be included. And he called him a printer because Benjamin West also made prints after many of his famous images, right? So that gives us the idea that pretty much everybody here was probably paying to be part of it. And that's a norm in group portraiture anyway, that the people in group portraits usually paid to be put there. Right? Now we've got a really terrific West in the National Gallery. I really like this picture a lot. It's this massive portrait of Colonel Guy Johnson. He's on the right. And, well, I guess I didn't have to tell you which one is Karangianche, right? I think it's pretty obvious which one's which. Which of these two guys is British? Which of these two guys is the Native American? It's not that hard to figure out. This was painted the year of the Revolution in London, right, where West had settled. And it was commissioned by Colonel Guy Johnson, who had come back from America to London to try to secure a job for the British troops. he wanted to be superintendent of the Indian nations in the northeast sector of America, right? So not even down here, right? We're talking like New York, Connecticut, Boston, Maine, right up in that area. And he was going to be the sort of the liaison between the Indian tribes and the British troops so that they could rally them to help fight against the rebellious Americans, right? So he wants this job. And he goes back to London to get it, and he brings a chief of the Mohawk tribe with him, and that's Karongyonchie, right? Thank goodness you're not having an oral exam, right? It's a mouthful. And he had an English name as well, David Hill, Captain David Hill. So they're both in London now trying to get this job. And he commissions this portrait from West, and it's about 7.5 feet tall, right? It's larger than life size. And the point of the picture is propaganda to help him get the job, to help him become this new go-between, the liaison between the British troops and the Indian nations of the far northeast. And the point is to show his close alliance with the Indians. Right? So, how has he done this? Let's look at the picture. You guys talk to me for a bit. Right? How does he show that he's got a tight alliance with the native tribes? Indeed, he's got quite a bit of Native American. He's still got his British red coat on, right? But yeah, he's got that hat, right? The moccasins. The belt is called a wampum belt, and that amazing blanket. We'd like to see that on Antiques Roadshow. We'd like to have that on Antiques Roadshow, right? To sell back. And even, I think that's probably some bead weaving underneath the coat, coming sort of diagonally across at the top of this white waistcoat. Right? So he's got all of, even though he's still got his musket, right? He's still got his arms, but he's wearing all of these things that were obvious, that he wants you to believe were freely given to him, right? Gifts from the Indian nations, from the Mohawks to him. How else does West convey this idea that the relationships between him and the Indians are good? Yeah? Sir?
What's the Indians giving them? It's nice. It's a pleasant look like he's like smiling at them.
Indeed, it's reverential even, right? Yeah. The fact that he's looking directly at him, and interestingly, you know, he's higher than he is in the picture, but West has put him back in shadow, right? Looks like they're in a cave or something, aren't they, right? And there's this inexplicable, or maybe this up against a cliff, but the light is entirely on Johnson, right? And it's on the side of David Hill's head on the left, but casts his face somewhat in shadow. So one turns directly toward the most important one, right? You know, and there's something about that is totally, you know, patronizing, isn't it? They're important and all, but they're back in the shadows, right? And yeah, that look is crucial. What else? Yeah, Kiki? Huh. Interesting. So that you read the gesture as being one of sort of in the middle of conversing. I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it. It's a little bit different from what most people say, but I think you're absolutely right that there's something about it with the facial features that suggests conversation. Even, and almost a conversation between equals, but one that still, you know, quite literally highlights Johnson, right? You'll notice that gesture of Karongyonchie, well, here, right, is actually can be read as a pointing as well. It's indexical. He's pointing towards something. What is that thing in his hand? Can you tell? Yeah. What kind of pipe? It's a peace pipe, indeed. So he's pointing directly at the peace pipe. And you can see it's burning. Look on the left at the bottom. And you can see, in fact, there's still some coals in it. So they have been smoking the peace pipe, right? Quite literally, yeah. No, it doesn't mean that, Sarah. Please. Is it 4:20? It's almost right. It's good. 15 minutes. I should have talked a bit slower, and then you could have been really laughing. Right? Perfect timing, right? So the peace pipe and the musket side by side. You'll notice that there's these two parallels, right? They come side by side. He's put the musket down. He's still holding on to it because he's working for the Brits, and that sort of sets the whole stage, doesn't it? Yeah, Danielle.
Fascinating with the leg.
His leg or Kurungyanchie's?
The latter.
He's standing with his legs crossed. So the one that you see is, that's how this works, right? It's like this,
Okay.
right?
It still looks.
It looks a little awkward because you see he's got this leg is fixed.
So I guess
right.
it's like leaning against the wall.
I think so, yeah. Or yeah, it must be certain.
Yeah.
I'm gonna fall over if I do this wrong. Right? And yeah, that's what's going on with his leg down there. So it is kind of a fascinating thing. Now, this concept of cooperation, right? The fact that they're getting along, which is the main message, continues in the background. I have this great detail, right? Because there we see directly behind them an Indian family gathering together around the warmth of the fire. I love the little baby hugging the puppy in front. The mother with the child in the papoose, and the three braves over there, and also sort of engaged in conversation with this symbol of wild America, right? The falls behind them. This is the great, wild, untamed America. And it's a small detail, but it's an important one, and obviously one that West chose to put in here. And it simply adds to the idea that these are the people that he is mediating with, and they're sitting around really quite peacefully. Do you recognize the pose of one of them? Look at the Indian sitting down with his elbow on his knee. Yeah, it's the exact same pose that we saw him using for a very different image, right? So this is, again, that sort of neoclassical approach which says that there's a particular pose. And there's a good chance we could probably figure out some Greek sculpture that this eventually quotes from, or maybe a Renaissance painting, right? We really wanted to get into it, but he's reusing it again, even for the smaller detail, because these things are entirely fabrications. Any painting's a fabrication, right? Paintings aren't photographs. So it's up to the artist to put these things together in a way that actually makes the sort of meaning that they're trying to get across. Right. Our second artist of the colonies is John Singleton Copley, also born in the colonies, moves to Europe in 1774, goes to Rome. From there, he goes to London in 1775, October no less, late in 1775, and stays on because he's also a British sympathizer. Right? Comes from a long line of them. One of his most famous portraits, I don't think I have it here, is the famous portrait of Paul Revere holding his teapot, right, as a metalsmith. And his political inclinations never got in the way of him working for this or that patron, even while he was here. So he stays on in London as the war is breaking out. You'll notice here with this image of his family, a year after he got there, 1776, as the war actually did break out, his wife and kids come to join him. And he paints this picture to sort of like, the family's back together again, you know? Everyone's happy now. Mom's on the right with three cute little girls, a fourth daughter grabbing onto his father-in-law, his wife's husband, playing with a little rattle. I've got a detail to show you. And there's Copley's up in the back. And he's leaning on that parapet. He's been looking out at that wild landscape. Looks sort of like, the Shenandoahs or something, doesn't it? And again, raging river behind them. This is probably the legacy that he remembers from America. If we look closely, there's a study for it that he did when they got there. I thought that's right. I didn't know, but I just found this very, very recently, that we've got the study that he did for the picture as well as the painting itself. So it was painted in order to sort of celebrate their return. And Copley, with his powdered wig on, has been drawing, and you can see, in fact, that he's got two drawings or maps in his hands, right? And so with the idea that his body is turned toward that landscape suggests that he's been drawing from life, right? And that he's turned from that in order to look toward us, right? To pose, if you will. Hang on, my thing just stopped connecting. Come back to Papa. If this doesn't work this time, I'm going over there. Here it comes. Right. His youngest daughter at the bottom has that really great rattle with, you can see she can even hang it around her neck, right? There's a little ribbon so she can put it around her neck. And she's doing her darndest to try to get the attention of Grandpa, who really doesn't look like the nicest guy to have around at Thanksgiving or whatever. His name is Richard Clark, and she's trying to get his attention. He was one of the merchants in Boston whose tea was dumped overboard during the Boston Tea Party, right, in 1773. So they're from a long line of, British royalists during the Revolutionary War. And of course, he's lost all of his investment. Now he's back in London as well with his son. His wife is sitting with the other kids. And if we look at this sort of isolated version of his wife, which he drew independently anyway, certainly they were posed, right? He made the portraits from them sitting for him. But it's up to him to tell them how to sit. Up to him to arrange the figures, not only as he's drawing them, but also then as he makes the finished portrait, right? That's a choice he gets to make. And I think she looks like any number of these Holy Families that we've seen. Another Raphael-esque arrangement of that grouping of figures so that they become this sort of pyramid of forms with her at the top. But still, it's really a very intimate portrait. It's really captured the sense of family dynamics. I do like the fact that he doesn't like his father-in-law. It seems like he doesn't, because he hasn't made him very flattering. Right? The next year back in London, he paints this. Also at the National Gallery, there are two versions of this, and ours is better. His first major history painting, and this is a really interesting event in the history of history paintings. A history painting is, of course, a painting of an event, right? Of an historical event, a history painting. And there are history paintings going back centuries, back to the Renaissance. Even before, really, we have medieval history pictures, really. But usually they are things that happen to leaders or major military victories. That was the norm, right? If it's going to be a history painting that tells a particular story or a particular event, it was an event that had national significance, right? So think of Benjamin West just a second ago with the death of General Wolfe. That's a contemporary history painting, but it's not just a sort of an everyday sort of thing or even happening to normal people. Normal, everybody's normal, but happening to people without a leadership position. Right? This one breaks that ground. This one shows us a newsworthy event, right? It was something happened that was fairly big, but it's not happening to anybody that has leadership, has that sense of national importance. And I might argue, I have to look into this some more because I don't do 18th, 19th century stuff as a research interest, but is this the first ever? In intro class, when I showed you the raft of the Medusa, right? You might remember, it comes up in this slideshow, but if you remember the raft of the Medusa, that shipwreck where the cannibalism, right? Jericho, it's 1818. It's a contemporary news event that's non-royal. Everybody talked about it being the one great picture that really did this. This is 40 years earlier, right? And it's an event that was in the news that he ripped from the headlines and painted. And I think that there's something innovative about this that we might be able to relate to the American character. And that's this idea that the rules of, even though he's back in London, right? The rules of tradition don't matter that much. You can break them. Rules are meant to be broken. And goodness knows we do a pretty darn good job in America of breaking with tradition, don't we? I mean, that's one of the things we really pride ourselves on. And I would argue of all the things we pride ourselves on, it's one of the few things we do really well. You know, all the other things is like we have pride in things, but we don't really do them so well. You know, healthcare being one of them, right? But anyway, get off that horse. This is, and it even has this long inscription, right? It tells us exactly what happened here, right? So, oh, it is coming up right. Look, it's right there. There's the raft of the Medusa in your text. The French won't get around to it for another 40 years. But this is a really fascinating parallel, right, with these two pictures, because obviously they're both dangers at sea, right? Images of the perils of being out on a boat in nature, which is really kind of fascinating. And the fact that nature is a whole lot stronger than we are in our attempts to tame it, our attempts to control it, right? So the raft of the Medusa, which we'll talk at length about, is this raft that was built from the wreckage of a boat called the Medusa that went down in 1816 off the coast of Senegal, and 150 people survived. Initially, they built a raft from broken hull, and by the end of their time at sea, there was like 15 left. And the other ones either died of gangrene or drowning, or they parched to death, or they starved, and there were reports of cannibalism, and it was just this horrific event, right? Written by the survivors. And in Jericho's picture, you see that they're about to flag down the ship, which is just this barely tiny little speck on the horizon, just beneath the two rags that they're waving. And you just get the sense of hopelessness, right? The waves are taller than they're waving, and they're just trying as best they can. But you'll notice that at the top of that pyramid of people, the guy who's raised up the highest, that they've all pushed up, right? They're holding, he's black. He's an African. And the person who's at the apex of competence is also black. I don't think that's a coincidence. I'm betting Jericho knows this and has appropriated it into his image. Right? And you can even see some of the bodies there kind of remind us of the body of Watson in the water. You know? Some of Jericho's bodies, the one in the lower right corner, one in the lower left corner, sort of have something. And again, with this idea that they're manipulating it for their own use. So, interesting parallels between these two pictures. Now, the story on your right, what's going on here. Brooke Watson. Don't ask me why he was swimming naked, because he probably wasn't, right? However, neoclassical artists looking back to Greek Roman works for inspiration, that probably accounts for the nakedness, right? I guess it's also like man, you know, he's back to nature. Well, he's fallen in, and he's lost his right leg already to the shark. And you can see that he's kind of downplayed this, Copley has. The right leg kind of disappears into this muddy mass, but you can see that there's not much left below the knee, and that the water there has turned slightly red, right? Now, it could be a whole lot more gory, but it's still there when you see it. And that wonderful gesture, his hands under the water, right? The arm goes down, hits the water about here, the shoulder, and his fingers come back up out. And you can actually see where the water breaks around the knuckles of his left hand, right? And the right hand then out. And they've thrown him a rope. They're going to try and help pull him out. And you notice who's got the rope. Again, it's the black guy, right? It's going to be instrumental in saving him. And the shark's coming around for, seconds, I guess. Actually, it's thirds, because this is his third swipe at Brooke Watson, and they save him, right? He actually isn't killed by the shark. But he's 14 years old. This takes place. How's this for the news as well? It's in Havana. It's in the harbor outside Havana, Cuba, right? And it's this dramatic moment when he's rescued from the grips of death, right? Literally from the mouth of death, pulled out, right? Now, one of the things that West is going to try and do here is not only to emphasize the danger of the shark, and look at how big that shark is. Look at the tail behind the boat. This jaw's big, you know? Sharknado big, right? It's a massive, he doesn't know sharks very well, right? But he's got the double row of teeth okay. But it's not the best drawn shark, and you can cut him a little slack, you know? The idea of walking down to the New Orleans Zoo and, you know, the aquarium and seeing a great white shark is probably more difficult for him. But yeah, it still captures, I think, the terror of the moment. As again, the eyes. Look at Watson's eyes, right? He's 14 years old, and he is staring right at you can't see it, but right at the eye of that shark as it's coming in, and he's already missing his leg. Yeah, it's pretty horrific. What Copley wants to do here in painting this, did I say West a second ago? Copley, is he wants to heroize, right, turn into heroes the rescuers, right? In addition to showing us sort of the perils of man against nature. And the way to do this, just like what West did with General Wolfe, the way to do this is to turn to artistic examples that would then make the leaders into heroes, right? And what he did was he sort of cast his net all over the place. It's kind of a wonderful grouping of things. Raphael did this series of cartoons, drawings, for tapestries, around 1516, 1518. That would be hung, the tapestries were hung in the Sistine Chapel underneath Michelangelo's ceiling. And they showed the Acts of the Apostles, right? The drawings are now in London, which is where Copley's living, right? But they were originally sent up to Brussels to be woven by the great tapestry weavers there. And one of them is this moment of the miraculous draft of fishes. This is where on the Sea of Galilee, the apostles are coming up with nothing. And Jesus says, why don't you cast your nets on the other side? And they go, oh, I guess if you say so. And they do it, and all of a sudden they get more fish than they can pull in, right? And so you see the two apostles in the back there yanking at the net, and you can see the boat in the foreground is just chock full of fish, right? And here's the original cartoon for it, right? And you can see the two figures reaching for Watson are obviously derived from the two apostles pulling the fish. And this idea of miracles and fish and yanking things out of the water are elements that he's, you know, somebody said, well, these are the themes I'm dealing with. What would be a good work of art to go look at for this? And because he took his art history classes, he knew where to turn, right? He knew what to look at and turn specifically to this. So there's a good chance he knew the original drawing. And the way that tapestries are made, that's why it's reversed as well, right? This is Raphael's original drawing. But that's not where he stops. Kind of like Benjamin West, where he's pulling in different references, right? For the body of Watson, he turns to this famous statue, Hellenistic statue of Laocoon. And again, it's the theme that he's trying to emphasize. I used to think it was Laocoon himself. Laocoon's the guy in the center. And he's being killed with his two sons, but I think it's the son on the left that Watson's based on. Look at even the hand, right? Back and forth between the son on the left and Brooke Watson, right? So he's changed the other hand because he's no longer yanking at a serpent. You guys remember this from intro? You should. I just want a pretty cool piece. It's huge too. It's over life size. But he's the priest in Troy who tried to warn the Trojans not to take the Trojan horse. Right? Beware strangers bearing gifts. Okay? And the gods want the Greeks to win the Trojan War. So the gods, Neptune in particular, wants Laocoon to shut up, right? So that the Greek gift of the Trojan horse will be accepted, and then the Greeks can destroy Troy. So what Neptune does is he sends these serpents out of the water to destroy Laocoon and his sons, right? And that's what we're seeing here with the sea serpents wrapped around them in all these different ways and biting his hip. And again, if we think about the fact that what Copley's thinking, what Copley's considering is the idea of sort of strange, scary, miraculous things happening with the ocean. This is another work of art that is an immediate sort of, oh yeah, of course, I'll use that, right? Another one that's kind of interesting, and this doesn't have quite so much to do with the water, but maybe in a way it does, is this Raphael that shows Saint Michael, the Archangel Michael, slaying the demon. It says dragon, sorry about that, I should say demon. Another Raphael, and you can see that the man at the stern, excuse me, the helm of the boat is very much sort of derived from this image by Raphael. How does this one work in? How does it then enhance the meaning? Yeah, Daniel. Indeed, right? The demons of nature, if you will, right? And again, the saintly activity of putting yourself at risk in order to harpoon that thing, right? So he is like the Archangel Michael, very much, and makes, again, emphasizes not only him, but the demonic nature of that shark, right? So again, as a neoclassical work of art, as we've seen, it's reference heavy, right? It's full of these allusions to past art, none of which are happenstance. And I think that's the key thing to keep in the back of your mind, the key thing to remember for your own art, for the studio people, is that when you're thinking about works of art that you might be influenced by for a particular project, it's quite important to be careful about what you choose. And try to choose things that are really relevant to what you're working on. You know? And spend some time really thinking about it as best you can. Seek advice if you can, right? I think the last American artist we'll get to today is Trumbull, and now this disappeared again. Come back to me, please. Give me just a second here. Logging in. On the left, you see Alexander Hamilton by Trumbull. Trumbull came from a very wealthy family in Connecticut, well politically connected, and unlike West and Copley, he was on the side of the rebels, right? True American artist, if you will, right? Really the real deal. And stays behind. He was a colonel in Washington's army. He was the map maker to General Washington during the war. And after the war, he stays on and does portraits of many of the heavy hitters of the colonial era, of the revolutionary movement, right? That doesn't mean that he doesn't travel. He goes to France after the revolution in 1780 to study art. There are no great art collections yet in America that are open to the public, so Americans are still going to Europe. We're lucky, right? We get to go downtown. We go to the National Gallery. We see wonderful things there. Well, they had to get in a boat, right, and go across. And there's other things to do in France. But when he's in France, he then goes to England, and it's right around the same time that England recognizes America's independence. When we fought the battle in 1776, in 1783, is that right? Yeah, 1783, England recognizes our independence. Fine, we're done. We're not going to try and fight and get you back. Well, they do in 1812, but other than that, right? They've recognized our independence. And so this is about the same time that Trumbull gets to London, right, where things are settling down. And he actually meets up with Benjamin West in London. And their politics being on opposite sides of the whole American independence issue doesn't get in the way of a good professional relationship. right? They get on. And they don't let it get in the way, right? At the moment of 1783, when England recognizes the independence of the United States, West hits on this brilliant idea. Illustrate the war. Show it in paintings, sell engravings, make a mint, have a gallery where people come in and experience the war and go out with a postcard, as it were, right? But a print, right, that it would sell. And he never really gets around to it. He says, this is going to be a really great idea. He says, John, why don't you take this? This is a good idea. And he gives it to Trumbull. And he says, this is a money maker. Why don't you do it instead? And gives off his best idea to this younger artist who shows up. And so he does. And on the left is one of the prints after a painting. The paintings are, I think, up in Yale. I think they're all up at Yale. I mean, if you paid Yale tuition, we could just walk across campus, but we can't, right? And the famous signing of the Declaration, right, is part of this project that he's going to do to illustrate the Great War of Independence. And then the Battle of Bunker Hill on your left, and you can barely read the label at the bottom, is one of the prints after this, right? So this is his new project, if you will, right, is to illustrate the war. And it's really successful, just like West said it was going to be. It's hugely successful. And this led to a different commission for him in the 1820s, actually late 1810s. He was commissioned to paint the murals in the Capitol Dome, in the rotunda of the Capitol Dome. So he takes some of them, not all of the series from the war, but the peaceful wars, right? There's no Battle of Bunker Hill under the rotunda because it's about, what's the Capitol Dome about? It's not about revolution. It's about peace, prosperity, right? Although there's some pictures that we'll see later which are really pretty wicked, evil, racist stuff still going on in that. Pocahontas being baptized, right? Things like that, right? But at the same time, he chooses the Declaration of Independence. He does it mural scale, right? That one's 12 by 18 feet, right? The one in Yale is significantly smaller on the right. But he redoes these now on this commission from the U.S. government. This came in the aftermath of the War of 1812, which you may or may not know is when the old Capitol, the original Capitol, burned to the ground. Right? So they've rebuilt the Capitol Dome, and now there's new decorations being made. Right? So Trumbull is the obvious choice. He'd already illustrated some of the major scenes that they wanted anyway, and they commissioned it from him and others as well. Right? So here we see the actual signing of the Declaration of Independence and the original composition and the mural composition on your right. It depicts Jefferson and Franklin right in the middle. You can see they're here, right? Sorry about that. We'll go back. There's Jefferson and Franklin. What they're doing is they're handing over the draft of the document to John Hancock, who's seated in the chair there, to be ratified, right? And the other people around him, you can find online whoever, I don't care, right? You identify every one of them. Go on a tour of the Capitol. They'll tell you who they all are, right? But Hancock was the president of the Constitutional Congress, right? And the other people behind them are the rest of the drafting committee. And that green thing almost looks like they're sitting on a little pedestal, but it's just the carpet. Otherwise, you can see the fellow in the brownish coat is having a difficult time standing there if it doesn't work that way. So there, all the papers strewn over the desk. Here is our finished document. I love how Franklin is helping him hand it over, even though it's obviously a one-person job, And he's got his finger out almost. Oh, that's his thumb, isn't it? I take it back. It's not Franklin. It's not helping, but he's got his thumbs on it there to hand it over. And there's Hancock about to put his John Hancock on it, right? Which is why his signature is so large. He was president of the Constitutional Congress, right? And that's why we talk about your signature being your John Hancock, right? Is because he's the first to sign off on this. And then the other ratifiers sign beneath him, right? So He's given this position almost like a king. He's got this massive chair, bigger than the other ones. Parts of it are gilded. Other parts have red velvet. All of this evokes the idea of kingship almost. And in many ways, at this point, we've had a president. But this happened in, when did this take place? 1797, I think is when this, right? Is that right? Does anybody know? When did we sign the Declaration of Independence? No, 1776. It's got to be, right? So, you know, the president of the Constitutional Congress is about as close as we got to a king, right? It's before Washington even. Yeah? And they're setting him apart as such. And we'll see that a lot of these images, and he's also on a dais, isn't he? His steps up a bit, right? A lot of these American pictures from this time are going to try to make the point, especially these after Napoleon, right? This version is later as well. But they're going to try to make the point that we have people who could have been kings, but they're not. They choose not to be, right? And that's, I think, part of the undercurrent of this one, is that Hancock is in a position as close to king as existed at the time, right? In order to paint this, right, Trumbull, with the original version, goes and visits Jefferson in Paris, right, who gets his first-hand account of what happened. So he's interviewing Jefferson, saying, so how did this all work? Well, you know, Hancock was sitting there, and he had a little bit of a dais, and we were all gathered around, and then it was that was me that handed it over to him. Right, and Ben was right behind me on my left, and all. And so he uses that description to lay out the composition because he wasn't there, right? Jefferson at that point sat for his own portrait when he's visiting him, interviewing him. Franklin and Hancock came to visit him in Paris. They sat for their portraits. The other ones, he had sketches of them, right? Had smaller studies that he used. But everything's been restaged. Just like with Benjamin West, this is a staging of a historical event rather than a photograph, rather than exactly how it happened. It's important to keep that in mind. This one was not part of the original series, but a new composition after this new commission came through at the end of the teens, where George Washington, is giving up his commission. This is the end of his role as president. This is the end of his tenure as president, right? And during his tenure as president, he was also commander-in-chief. This is why we started that tradition, right? Because there was still the very real danger of continuing to fight for our independence, the lefty in me thinks that's the whole Second Amendment right there, because we had to be on guard at that point. And so Washington here, at the end of his presidency, is handing back the commission that gave him the role of commander-in-chief, military commission, right? Giving it to the president of the Continental Congress. You'll notice that the chair that he'd been sitting in is the same chair that Hancock was sitting in the other picture. It's just draped with this massive cloak that makes it even seem more like a regal throne, right? That's passed from Constitutional Congress to Washington. Washington stood up and he's vacating it, right? This is an incredibly important moment in American history, and it became more important as time went on, because some people feared, here we go, right, that Washington might try to parlay his role as the head of the military into something bigger, that he might stay on, do something like usurp power for life. There was some fear that would happen. And so the fact that he had, in fact, chosen to step down, right, willfully gave it up when he didn't have to. There were no term limits or anything like that at this point. But he willfully gave it up, decided to become a farmer. He did. He moved to Mount Vernon, right? He decided to become a farmer. That was crucial for defining our national character, right? Absolutely crucial for defining that. So you had to become a man among men, subject to the same laws as everybody else, right? And the fact that he became a farmer made it kind of biblical, didn't it? You think about that, I think it's in the Psalms, Proverbs, you will beat your swords into plowshares, right? There's a time of peace that you will turn your swords into something that you farm with. You're not going to kill people anymore, right? And the fact that he became a farmer became part of this mythology around Washington, right? That he's now the man who's chosen humility over greatness, if you will, right? And that made him even greater. Interestingly enough, the year that no, I've got my dates wrong, so forget this. One of the things that's interesting about that is the fact that in the interim between when he stepped down and when Trumbull paints this, Napoleon had happened, right? And the French had shown that, in fact, a leader who might be part of the revolution could, in fact, parlay that into something that was exactly what you revolted against in the first place, right? And so in retelling the story now in the 20s and restaging it, the memory of the terror of Robespierre, of Bonaparte, right, is kind of a real one. And showing this becomes that much more important. And it's interesting that, he's still in military uniform with his supporters behind him, right? I don't know, did he wear military uniform while president all the time? I don't know, right? Part of me thinks probably not. But I don't know. That's how he's being shown here, though, isn't it? He's somebody who could have the troops do what he says and simply stay on. And being shown in military uniform makes him sort of look like Bonaparte, doesn't it? Makes him sort of think like Napoleon we always saw. Do I have it coming in? I don't know if I brought that Napoleon. I didn't bring that one in. But if you think about the Napoleon we looked at, there he is in military uniform, about to review his troops. And he decides to go from general to emperor. Washington decides to go from general and president to farmer, right? So this is the anti-Napoleon, if you will, right? The opposite of this, right? Now, that brings us to this next one. You'll notice the pose in each of these two is almost exactly the same, right? One hand down at his side next to, in the Trumbull painting, it's next to his sword. Here it's with a baton. The other hand extended out to the side. The one on your left in the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the so-called Lansdowne portrait. There's so many portraits of Washington that they pick up nicknames so that you can keep them apart, right? Because even Stuart did dozens of portraits of George Washington. Yeah. Here he's already stepped down. He's gone back. He's become a man of the people. He's wearing a plain black suit, right? Powdered wig, right? He's just a man of the people now. But the pose has been repeated. Now notice the dates on these two things, right? The Trumbull picture is a new composition in 1824. There's a good chance he's looking back at Gilbert Stuart as he's composing the picture, because he's putting it together. He's restaging it, right? It's artificial in a way. It's a couple steps removed from reality. And it's a reality that he himself never saw, right? So there's a good chance that Trumbull used this Stuart portrait for his. What's interesting also is that pose that Washington has in both of these is the pose of the Apollo Belvedere, a very famous statue in the Vatican, right? A Roman copy of a Greek statue of the sun god. The sun god, right? Who was the sun king? The king of France, right? We saw even a picture of Napoleon had absconded this statue. We saw a little etching of Napoleon showing off some of his war booty to his followers. That's what he's pointing to. Apollo, the sun god, right? The favored god of Roman emperors, right? Roman emperors proclaimed themselves to be the earthly embodiment of Apollo, as often as not, right? And for Napoleon, that was what it meant. Here, it's another way of, I think, showing that Washington could have been, chose not to be, right? But he's got it. He had everything it took to do that, and it's elevating him to that status without, and saying that the character of the man gave him the wherewithal to not do that, to not be self-serving. Yeah, Sarah.
Did you say that they intentionally try to make him similar to Napoleon?
I'm saying what they're trying to do is to make him different from Napoleon. They're going to show you that he could have done what Napoleon did. So there are certain similarities, right?
Yeah, reading on the left is similar to that work that we went through with Napoleon who did been fighting.
Yeah, but I was going to compare them, and I looked at the dates, right? That's 1812. So this is, why do we make you memorize dates? Is to do this. Because I thought that would make a really nice thing to make him another way of making him the anti-Napoleon. Maybe Napoleon's being the anti-Washington in that one. I don't know. I don't know if he would have known this picture or not, right? But it is kind of interesting because both of them have a very similar theme in that on the desk are the symbols of their intellectual pursuits. The code of law, the Constitution of the United States, is underneath the desk. There are elements, there's eagles on the corner of that desk. We saw imperial eagles in Napoleon's work as well. And it's one of those things that's so interesting and so similar that it's very hard to chalk it up to coincidence, right? So it's a very sort of fascinating thing that you're bringing up here, and I don't have an answer to it, right? Yeah. No, it is. It's true. Very much so. So, the favorite god of Roman emperor. So, what do we have? Let's see what's coming up. There's a copy of this, an almost exact copy of this, in the White House collection, right? And in fact, this is kind of a fun thing, and we'll end with this, right? But you'll see he's still got his sword in his hand, right? And he's gesturing to the table, but he's pointing out, like, I'm not doing this, I'm doing this. And there's an inkwell right behind it, pen and the sword, right? The pen is mightier than the sword. He's doing research about freedom and so forth. And then underneath the table is the books. And this one, there's a massive megapixel scan of this as part of the Google Art Project. History of the American Revolution, Constitution and Laws. And in the original one in the Smithsonian, United States is spelled properly. But in the copy, Gilbert Stuart intentionally made it say United States so that you would know that that was the copy and not the original, right? So we'll talk more about this because it's such a really terrific portrait. He's wearing his wooden teeth, and that's why he looks so darned unhappy, right? Look, he's just he apparently had just had them fitted, and the famous and apparently they hurt like hell, and doesn't he just look? No, this is not the best idea I've ever had, right? Maybe I should just go without my teeth. So we'll pick up with this. So Thursday, no class. Maybe I'll just wrap this up online, and that will take care of the class, and you'll have all that material to review the study sheet, right? I think that's a good thing to do because there's not that much left here, just the Peels. The Peel family. So we'll take care of that with an online thing that I'll get up probably Friday morning. I'll have it ready because I got 2 classes on Thursday and meetings all day tomorrow. So, right? Right. Come to the opening, not the opening, but the reception.